Welcome back onto the next episode of Down. This is our Comrades podcast for CoachParry.com. My name is Brad Nadalt. I've got the coach Lindsey Parry with me once again. Lindsey, we're inching towards the end of January. First of the big Comrades qualifiers took place on the weekend. So Johnson Crane, some great stories coming out of that. We've got a whole bunch of marathons coming your way over the next few weeks as well. We've got the Joburg North Marathon happening this coming weekend, the Jeppe the Baldwin Marathon series starts the week after with Jeppe Marathon, and then it's Peninsula. They're all coming through thick and fast, but we'll be talking more about that a little bit later on. But in today's episode of the podcast, we wanted to talk specifically about introducing intensity into your training. So speed sessions, hill sessions, tempo runs, those sorts of things we're going to be touching on. And then I also think, Lindsey, as the first month of, or the first big month of Comrades training, when things do start getting serious in the start of a new year, is just about done and dusted. I think it's important to talk about setting the right goal for Comrades. And we're going to talk about how to go about that and make sure that you're not overreaching and doing more harm than good when it comes to what you're actually training for and what a realistic goal would be come Comrades 2025. But let's jump straight into the intensity conversation, Lindsey. And Comrades is an interesting one because it's not like running a good Comrades. Speed's not the limiting factor. Obviously, you need to make sure that your endurance is really good, but having higher intensity sessions in your training plans are important. And there's a whole bunch of different things you can do. Not all intensity sessions are created equal. When we talk about intensity, let's talk about intervals. Like, what are intervals and what are their role in a training program?
Yeah, so Brad, I'm going to just touch on a point you made, which is just so true. I mean, strictly speaking, we don't need intensity sessions to finish Comrades. And we could argue that intensity sessions are your highest risk for injury. And so they could even compromise your ability to finish Comrades. But it's usually the reason, let me word that differently, the reason why it's typically a higher risk for injury is because people just don't do them well. So it's actually ironic that we planned this podcast to talk about intensity and talk about goal setting when the two things are actually so closely aligned. Because if we're training for the appropriate goal and therefore calculating the appropriate intensities that we do our sessions at, then that risk is massively reduced. Okay. And also the way we introduce intensity into the plans can also further reduce that risk. And that's why I typically like to start with hill training in a lot of the plans that I prescribe, is because hills add an additional layer of strength that's very specific to running, but also preps your body for doing higher intensity or faster workouts that'll come next. And as I touched on in the first podcast, for the down run, one of the benefits of doing higher intensity work is that it does improve our capacity for eccentric load. And for the down run, that's a critical factor, is being prepared for that eccentric load. And then, of course, the other good reason for hills is because if you don't live in a particularly hilly area, Comrades down run still has massive mountains that you need to get over. And so we still want to do a little bit of specific hill work and hill training to help us prepare for that. So high intensity sessions typically come in the form of intervals. Intervals come in a huge variety of ways that you can do them. You can do them on the track as specific distance intervals. You can do time-based intervals. You can do fartlek type of intervals that vary in duration, pace, rest intervals, and so on. You can have fixed rest, fixed time intervals. Hill work falls into intervals. We can do them at various paces, from very fast on the shorter, sharper intervals to longer intervals like 10 minutes, 2 kilometer intervals that are in the form of sort of tempo work. And those probably lean themselves to more specific to Comrades. If we're doing slightly longer intervals at a slightly lower intensity, they're still creating that eccentric load, but they're probably just closer in terms of energy system development and efficiency. So how do we do that? Well, I've already said it. I like to add in some hill work that we do for a 3 to 6 week period that lays the foundation for some intensity work. And then I typically go from long to short. So in other words, we start with longer intervals again, because the risk is lower of going way too fast on longer intervals. So if you've got a 1,000 or 2,000 meter interval, the chances of you running that so fast that you pull a muscle are much lower than if I gave you 200s and 400s. So that's the main reason I like to go from this longer to shorter. But of course, for Comrades, we probably won't get anything shorter than 400. And when we get to the 400, it's very important that you literally are doing them at the speed you need to do them for the medal that you are training at, because that is what keeps that risk of injury low, but it still gives you the eccentric load that we're looking at to help prepare you for Comrades.
Yeah, Lindsey, it's one of those things that I said it in the introduction, that not all intervals are created equal. And I made this mistake for the longest time, and I think a lot of runners do, is we see intervals on a training plan, whether it's hill repeats or whether it's 400s or whether it's 2,000 meter repeats, and we think we've just got to go and smash those as hard as we can. And that's not actually the way you want to be doing these things. It does become quite complicated how you work out what pace you should be running at. And that's why I love what we do at Coach Parry with our training app, is when you put your threshold pace in, it actually works out exactly the pace you should be running those intervals. So it makes your life a lot easier. If you want to get access to those plans with the sort of training watch builder, we've got integration with Garmin, with Suunto, with Coros. It's Polar. It's super easy to do. You can send that workout straight to your watch, and it guides you as you're doing it if you're going too fast or if you're not going fast enough. But how do you work out what pace you should be doing these intervals and hill repeats or 400s or 2,000s, whatever?
Probably the easiest way to do it for the lay person is quite simply to go, right, what is my ability on a 5K? Once you know your ability on a 5K, you can tweak slightly up and down how you do these intervals. And sorry, one very important point of clarification is that because of the nature of what we're training for, and because again, I try to limit how too fast people can do these things, I have shorter rest intervals, okay, on the plans, so that it almost forces you to not run each one to the absolute best of your ability. You know that because you've got shorter rest, you actually have to hold yourself back through the first half of those intervals. Okay. So that's kind of how those intervals are designed and why they are designed that way. That also forces you towards more of a speed endurance type of session rather than a speed session. And when I use phrases like this, the sprint coaches always get very worked up, because as far as they're concerned, when you use words like speed and speed endurance, speed is speed, and you can only work on speed if you're running like less than 60 meters, 30 meters to really work on speed. But anyway, that's just a funny anecdote, as I was saying it. Our sprint coaches always get warmed up.
That only works for the guys right at the front of the field who want to be on TV on Comrades Race Morning. So that's the rest of us, we can ignore that advice.
Exactly. So whatever, we tend to work on 400s as our shortest one, okay? And then and I compromise the rest specifically so that we still work on the eccentric load, but we work more. It forces you to remain at a place where you can still recover aerobically in between, so that you can keep your pace consistent. Okay, so that all sounds very complicated. What's the simple way of thinking about this? The simple way of thinking about this is I run a 5K, or I've got a good idea of what I'm capable of a 5K, and then my 1,000 meter repeats will be 3 to 5 seconds faster than my 5K pace. My 800s will be 5 to 6 seconds quicker. My 400s will be 8 or so seconds faster than my 5 kilometer pace. And if you use that, that's going to move your speed forward. It's going to improve your musculoskeletal coordination. It's going to improve your range of motion. It's going to improve your ability to withstand the eccentric load. And it's going to come at a pretty low risk of getting you injured.
All right, Lindsey. So let me also just touch on, there's two points I want to make here. So the first one, I said it at the start, is that speed is not the limiting factor. And I think one of the things that where the penny dropped for me was when somebody explained it to me this way, that if you look at the Comrades medals, and let's use Bill Rowan as an example, to run a sub 9 hour Comrades, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the average pace is about 6 minutes per K that you've got to run for Comrades.
Just over 6, but 6 is good enough for the maths.
And if you took the entire Comrades field, even the guys who are 12 hours, like they are on the border, and you said to them, go and run a K in 6 minutes, 99% of the Comrades field will be able to run a 6-minute K. One of them. That's just the reality of it. So it's not being able to run fast that's stopping you run the Comrades you want to run. It's having that endurance. So it's not about going flat out on every single one of these things. It's dialing in that pace. And that was for me, when I'd realized that, I was like, okay, now I need to really concentrate on doing these things properly. The second point I wanted to make with these intervals, and I don't think you did touch on it, is often we make the mistake, we have hill repeats or we have 400s on our training plan. So we go and do it. In the first one, we smash and we go, woohoo, that was awesome. But by the time we get to rep number 5 or 6, we are absolutely shattered and we know we're close to what we should be doing. How do you execute these sessions properly? Is it a case of starting slightly slower and making sure they're all exactly the same? Or is it that? Do we go out as best we can on the first one and hang on for dear life for the last?
Yeah, so an ideal scenario for a interval session, whether you're doing 6, 10, 12, whatever the number of repetition is, the ideal scenario is that your first and your last are done at a very similar time, and that the ones in between match those 2 times. So in other words, you are fairly consistent through them. So in a very typical interval session, I also find that we only really warm up properly at like number 2 or 3. So typically number 2, 3 are maybe a little bit quicker than number 1, but then we really want to stay consistent and, if anything, be a little bit quicker on the last one. But this notion where we start really fast and then start to slide down because we can't recover enough in between, that just tells you that you've gone too hard on the first one. And if we just stick to those basic formulas of being 3 to 5 seconds quicker than your so if you run a 25-minute time trial, then if you do your 1K repeats at 4:55, you're not going to go wrong. You're going to get a good workout. You're going to start to feel just a fraction fatigued when you get towards the end of that workout, but you're going to hold that pace consistently all the way through. If you're doing 400s, then you'll do them at about 4:45 to 4:50. They will feel maybe a little bit too easy at the start, but by the end, you will start to feel like I'm doing some work. And that's how you want to do the intervals to get the most out of them, particularly with Comrades in mind. And again, just reiterating that fact. I like using marathon qualifiers to highlight the point. If you want to run a silver medal, you've got to run 4:15 per K for 42.2 kilometers. That is quite fast, and you've got to sustain a fast pace for a long period of time. Now, if you're capable of a sub 3-hour marathon, then your easy training runs are supposed to be between 5 and 5:20 per kilometer. That's kind of your 4:50 maybe, okay? So to run a Comrades silver is around 5:03 per kilometer. So actually, it's your easy run pace that you need to be capable of doing for 90 kilometers. And so that's just there to highlight your exact point, is that it's not going to be your inability to run fast on the day that's going to compromise your ability to finish Comrades. It's going to be your inability to keep going at what is for you a relatively easy pace until it stops being an easy pace at around the 65 to 67K mark.
Yeah, and that leads us into the goal setting, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But Lindsey, before we wrap up the intervals, let's just talk about the terrain that we do them on. Obviously, hills are slightly different, but if we're doing 1,000s or 2,000s or 400s for that example, take the hill repeats out of this, because I've got a specific question about that in a moment. Does the terrain that we do this on matter? Do we have to do it on a track, or can we do it on the road? what if we only live in a hilly area? Is it okay to do these repeats where there are hills?
So ideally, you want to do them on a fairly flat surface, okay? Just because you can keep the consistency of the intensity right. So as soon as you throw in any kind of gradient, 450 on a flat road is not 450 on a 2% gradient, for example. So if you've got access to a track, that's great. But what you do want to try and do is just be in a slightly flat-ish area. Where I live, there's just hills everywhere, but we do have a little river that runs through where I live. So if I just go down to the river, there's an 800-meter stretch that's pretty flat. And so I just head down there, and if I have to run up and turn around a bit, whatever, that's what I'll do. So try and keep it flat, or as flat as you can manage for your area. And if there are undulations in there, then we just have to compromise on pace a little bit and focus more on effort. So it'll be a fourth if it's a 25-minute 5K guy again. If it's a 4:55 effort, because it's hilly, then that means that possibly maybe it's 500 meters slightly up on the way there and 500 meters down the way back. Then out, it's probably going to be 507, maybe even 510, depending on how steep that hill is. And then on the way back is going to maybe be 448 to 450. But the effort is at 455.
All right, let's talk hill repeats now. Are we finding the steepest, longest hill we can? What's the best way to do it? What sort of hill are we looking for to do these hill repeats? If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury-free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsey and I for our upcoming Faster Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K, and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now, or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there.
No, so we're looking at 3 to 5% gradient. So the average gradient of the Comrades hills is between 2.7 and 3%. Okay. And there's some that are quite a lot less, and just one or two that are long and steeper than that. But so a 3 to 5% gradient is absolutely fine. On the low end. So you're much better off doing a 2.5 to 3% than you are 5.5 to 6%. So too steep puts massive stress, in particular the hamstring and glute tendons and the Achilles. But really, the hamstring and glute tendons take shots if you're running too hard up very steep. So you 3 to 5, and you'd rather be on the low end than on the high end. And then it's harder to judge pace on hills than any other form of interval, because there's a little bit of a theory of relativity there, is that some people are relatively much better on hills than others. And that comes down to levers, running style, and strength. So those things definitely make a difference. And so what I want people to do on there is to kind of run at 5K-ish effort, so that when you start at the bottom, you can feel like you're doing a bit of work, but it's very manageable. When you get to the top, you can feel that your quads are really starting to burn, but it's still manageable. You don't want to get to the top feeling like, geez, I can hardly stand on these legs. They feel like jelly and so wobbly, or that you have to double over. You should get to the top feeling like, wow, I'm starting to feel like I'm doing work here. And then you turn around and either walk down or jog down, whatever you need to do just to get those legs feeling really fresh. But yeah, most of our watchers now will send a hill to, or you can go and analyze a hill, and it'll tell you what the percentage gradient is of that hill, and you're looking for between 3 and 5%.
Yeah, we've also put an article on our website. I'll pop the link into the description of this podcast as well. You can click through to it, where there is a bit of a description of the best sort of way to work out. I mean, 3%, if you're not quite sure what that means, it basically helps you calculate exactly what sort of hill you're looking for, how far you need to rise over the run, if that makes sense. So how far you got up for.
So in meters, you keep it in meters. So it's rise over run. So it's the height change over the distance that you run, and it's in meters. I don't think we've got a calculator that works out in
feet.
imperial, unfortunately. But yeah, so if you've got a 50-meter hill and you run 500 meters, that's going to give you a 5% gradient. So
Yeah, absolutely.
You go chuck those two numbers in and it'll tell you.
Yeah, so click on that link if you want to check it out, Lindsey. And then I'm going to ask the question. I know the answer, but I know someone else is going to ask the question too. With it being a down run, should we be doing down run intervals or downhill intervals?
No, so we don't do downhill intervals because they just are such a high risk for getting hurt. But again, if you live in a hilly area, you do want to be running hilly routes on your easy runs, and then you will get plenty of eccentric strengthening when you are running easy down those hills. If you don't live in a hilly area, it just becomes that much more important to do your strength training and make sure that you prepare yourself eccentrically there.
All right, absolutely. Well, before we get into looking at selecting the right goal and making sure you are on the right sort of goal for your Comrades attempt, I just wanted to say a big thanks to Anelia Mkwena, who has shared a link to last week's podcast. We were talking a little bit about sort of strength training and that sort of thing, but Anelia shared it in a running club WhatsApp group. I'm in so many WhatsApp groups, it's ridiculous. So I keep an eye on what people are doing, and I see Anelia shared the link to that podcast in there. So Anelia, what we're going to do is we're going to send you a Coach Parry cap for doing that. So we really do appreciate that. Thank you very much. Lindsey, let's talk about goals and making sure that we are training for the appropriate goal, because you mentioned, I think it was last week or the week before, where often we fall into the trap, especially around the Vic Claphams, where we are a sub 12-hour Comrades runner, but we think, you know what, if we train for a sub 10 or a sub 11, we're going to do slightly more and slightly faster. And if we're training with the peeps who are slightly better runners, we're guaranteeing that we're going to get that sub 12, but it doesn't really work that way. Let's talk about going about choosing the right goal, because that does impact the paces we're doing our easy runs, which you said is super important, and also the paces that we're doing our intervals at.
Yeah, and now is a really great time to talk about it, because we are essentially at the start of qualifying season. So the people that trained well through December and were ready for an early qualifier, have already had some people qualifying last week, ton people qualifying this week, loads of people qualifying the week after. And so over the next 6 weeks, we're really going to get a lot of people qualifying for Comrades. And that's a great time to make sure that you are training towards the right Comrades goal. And we need to base that on something. So deciding, you can't just decide what I want to run. And we went into detail there because we're not all created equal. We can't all handle the same kind of training, and doing training that's not suited for someone of your ability is a one-way street to getting sick, injured, or not even getting to start Comrades at all. So we want to be realistic about that goal. And look, the very easiest way of doing it is literally to just take your marathon time and multiply that by 2.5. That gets you close enough to the ballpark of what you should be training for when they release the very final distance for Comrades. We'll rejig the Comrades finishing time calculator so that come race day you can really narrow in and plan your race properly with your ultimate goal in mind. But starting now, you're looking at around 2.5 times. So if you're a 3-hour marathoner, that's silver. If you're a 4-hour marathoner, that is a Robert Machali. But that'll give you good ballpark figures of where to go. So be realistic about what you are capable of. Now, if you haven't run a marathon, then of course that makes it a little bit more complicated. And so maybe we can just talk quickly through let's say if you wanted to run a Bill Rowan. So if we're talking about Bill Rowan, then I'll talk you through the 5 and 10Ks that you are targeting to say that you are en route for that. So for Bill Rowan runners, roughly 22 minutes for 5Ks, in and around close to 22 minutes. That tells you Bill Rowan. 10K in and around 45 minutes, half marathon just over 140. Let's call it 142.34 around. That's kind of your ballpark that you want to be in. And if you want to run a sub 11, because that's probably the most popular medal, but if you don't want to be going for the finishes, want to train on the bronze, you're looking at around 27 minutes for 5Ks, around 55, 56 minutes for 10Ks, and just over 2 hours. Call it 2 hour 5, 2 hour 6, 7 for the half marathon. So that just gives you an idea of what you should be targeting if you want to run or set yourself that realistic goal for Comrades. And it's so important, Brad. We touched on it in detail earlier on in the series, but if you're running a 4-hour marathon and you try and train for a bull run, you are putting yourself at major risk of getting injured. What you can do, and this is the beauty about running and how these training plans work. If you're training at the appropriate plan for you, you will improve. So if you've run a 4-hour marathon now to qualify, you recover properly, and you train to the Robert Machali, that doesn't mean you're going to run 10 hours, because you are going to improve. And as we get closer to Comrades, there may be a club time trial that you run, or a half marathon, but not another marathon or an ultra. You're not going to race any of those things. That will point to you being 9.5 ready, 9 hours 15 ready, possibly even Bull Roan ready. But if you train for where you are now, and as you improve, you look to change, rather than you're a 10-hour now, I'm going to go and train at the 9 hours, then you're going to run into problems. And I think, Brad, that's, again, if I can just highlight really the strength of following our plans, because you can be on a 10-hour plan, but then you do a time trial and your threshold improves, then your paces and everything will tend down to closer to the bull run. And you'll actually be able to track your progress as you go. And you might get to a point in April where maybe a bull run is the right place for you to go to. But what's more important than that is what happens right now, and how that can really just ensure your success instead of putting you at risk. So work it out properly and train for the medal that you are capable of.
Yeah, Lindsey, because it doesn't, I mean, it obviously plays out in the mileage. The different plans have got slightly more mileage the faster you go, but it plays out in the majority of cases in your easy runs. And the vast majority of your training runs on these Comrades plans are easy runs. And the difference between an easy run for a sub-11 Comrades versus a sub-12 Comrades isn't that big. So it might still feel like you're not pushing super hard like you would be doing an interval, but pushing yourself slightly too hard in those easy runs is where the damage gets done in the long term for you not reaching your Comrades goal. Because just, if you wouldn't mind touching on the importance of running those easy runs easy enough, and that's why we are driving this point home so strong.
Yeah, because it's a slow poison, and because it is reasonably narrow in the example that you use between a finisher and a bronze, you can actually also feel quite good doing it. So you're not pushing hard as in like a race, but you're kind of on that borderline place, and so it actually feels quite good, and it becomes a slow poison. And it's only 2, 3, 4 weeks in that suddenly you're very tired, struggling to hit your paces on the runs that you're supposed to be running faster, feeling like it's just getting harder to get to your training. Motivation starts to wane a little bit, maybe even sleep starts to feel a little bit compromised, and you think it's normal because while I'm training for Comrades, obviously there's going to be some fatigue. But that's the problem with doing these runs just that little bit too quick all the time, is it's a slow poison that compromises your recovery because you're doing too much damage on the runs that are supposed to be done super easy. And outside of the sort of just normal is not the right word, but that's the standard issue with doing your easy runs too hard, which most people do, is it stunts your ability to progress like you should. It leaves you feeling tired and unable to do some of your workouts to the best of your ability. And it makes your performance stagnate. And then finally, of course, the most important thing is it just increases your risk of injury. because one of the single biggest risks for injury, quite frankly, is running on tired legs. Okay. So that's kind of the standard issue with training too hard on easy run days, even though it maybe feels easy enough. Make sure that you're running easy enough for you. But here's the real kicker. At Comrades is one of the few events that you will train for that you actually need to run slower on race day than you do on training days. And for a lot of people, that's a huge struggle for two reasons. Number one, you are not used to your muscles contracting and relaxing in that way. And that's why you get these like ridiculous sayings like, it feels harder to run slower. It's because it feels so foreign to you. Okay. So that's the first thing. Okay. And the second thing is that because you've got no idea what that feels like, it's why at Comrades we so often get, oh, but I felt like I was holding back and running so easy for the first 30 Ks. But you were 40 seconds a kilometer faster than you needed to be in those first 30 Ks. And Brad's been there with me so many times where someone who's run Comrades a few times says to me, I just can't run that slowly. And then I pull out their previous year's results and I can see they went way too fast in the first 30 Ks, but in the last 30 Ks, they ran even slower than we needed them to run. And I was like going, well, then how come you could do it in the last 30 Ks? So you also, that's for Comrades training, and especially when you do your training marathons, when you do, and if you're doing 2 oceans, we haven't even touched on that in this series yet, and for your Comrades long run, it's actually important to slow down even more and go at your Comrades pace so that you can feel what that feels like. And, I mean, geez, massive asterisks, so that you can also feel what your nutrition feels like at that reduced pace. Because that's another massive reason for why people get nauseous at Comrades, Brad. It's because they train at one intensity and get their nutrition dialed in at that intensity, but now they're a minute slower on race day. They don't need the same amount, the same frequency, and then you end up getting to 60 Ks and you're green and can't take any more.
So much to unpack there, Lindsey. You've opened up cans of worms, but we are going to get to that because we've run out of time on this episode. If you do have any follow-up questions about that, you can pop them into the forum on the Coach Parry app. Our coaches are in there and able to answer on a daily basis. If not, you can catch up with the podcast next week. And we're looking forward to sharing some more information with you in the Build It Comrades. If you are running your qualifier this coming weekend, best of luck. We look forward to hearing how it goes. Lindsey, as always, your time is hugely appreciated. Thank you for spending it with us here today. If you are enjoying this podcast, please make sure to leave us a review or a rating or whatever platform you're on. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. Until next week, from the two of us, take care. Cheers.